So I want to turn to our main speaker, silent here in the middle.
Silent but thoughtful. That's what the only one.
Lee Rotherham is a parliamentarian and a player, serious player in the machinations of the EU. Your biggest claim to fame probably is that you were on the team opposed to the Lisbon Treaty, so fighting for the fighting against the statehood of the EU, effectively, as I saw it. You wrote on something that Yaron picked up on, which was that there is a regulatory environment which you said costs the typical household £400 a year, which is the common agricultural policy. How can a policy intended to support and give us a robust agricultural industry end up costing us £400 a year?
Well, before I answer that, can I just briefly thank you for inviting myself and the other speakers here. I did, just briefly, I was a bit worried coming to this forum. I did check you up on the website, and I noticed that you're a forum for anarcho-capitalists, who sound like people from the city, so I was quite happy with that, and also minarchists, and I was very taken aback by that until I checked again and it said minarchists. I had no idea what a minarchist was, and I became very worried again. The CAP is basically what we're talking about. I did a costing a number of years ago at a time when agricultural prices were, global food prices were high, and therefore the relative costs were lower than they would be at other times. And I did actually work out that it's £398 per family per year, both in terms of direct subvention from the taxes that you're paying to support farmers, and also indirectly, basically, through the prices that you're paying for higher food bills. Now, that's excluding, of course, all the other things that the EU is responsible for. Common fisheries policy has the same effect, but from a different vantage point, and that adds another £2.81, I think it is, per week per family, because of decimation of stocks, scarcity value, and also the direct taxation on top of that. And then, of course, you've got all the other things which the EU is associated with in terms of the introduction of VAT, which covers a number of basic produces, and no doubt will be covered separately, and also the impact on energy bills and green costs. So, but specifically on the CAP, you're absolutely right, that is a major disaster, and it's basically because of the French. The French, since the 17th century, and certainly since the Napoleon, have been very conscious of the fact that their manpower in relation to other countries has been reducing. They have historically been trying to subsidise the countryside in order to maintain that le terrain, and it's just an extension of that by other means.
Okay. Ian, subsidies. Where did this come from, the policy?
I think you described it very well. It is. If you're looking at common agricultural policies, certainly as those are a result of very effective French lobbying in the EU. Well, not necessarily to say that we need to put too much of the onus on that. I mean, these have been around for quite some time. We haven't had this problem for all of that time. I mean, many of the economic trends that we see that allude to why this may be happening do tend to stem really from about sort of 2008 time. Earlier in the US, we've seen some of these trends for a number of periods. Here, actually, it's much more recent. And I'm not sure that if we look at things that have been going on for several years before that, they offer that much of an explanatory function.
Okay.
Oh, you also want me to talk to London, don't you? Because you're looking at the expectancy.
Let's get Kristian into that.
No, you're quite right. The common agricultural policy is not responsible for the recent food price increase, for what happened since the mid-2000s. But it's just that, say, for a while we've had falling food prices despite the common agricultural policy. So therefore it would have made, you could have said, well, maybe it's a stupid policy, it causes all kinds of inefficiencies, but somehow we can afford it. It's not such a big deal. Food prices are falling anyway, so what's the problem? But in a time in which they're already rising anyway, driven by global factors and other things, it makes sense to concentrate a bit more on that and say, well, so far we could indulge those French farmers that you were talking about, but maybe that was a luxury that we can no longer afford now.
Yeah, should we indulge French farmers just because we can?
The French. That means no. No, we should indulge any farmers. It is absurd. I mean, look, central planning doesn't work. It creates distortions, disincentives, and it creates them in every area in which it's tried. And certainly in farming, this is true. Now, again, I know a lot more about farming in the United States than I do in the European Union. In the United States, whole fields stay uncultivated because the government is paying people not to cultivate them. We have too much corn because the corn lobby has decided that ethanol is appropriate, which drives up prices of food based on corn elsewhere in the world. I mean, the distortive effects, this is the problem. The government today is so distorting the structure of production that it's almost impossible to keep track of all the different elements that are being distorted. When generally, if one looks at areas where the government has stayed out, that have been left unregulated, at least to some extent, nothing's completely unregulated, but at least to some extent, there's a consistent pattern that emerges. And that is that prices come down as quality goes up. In every realm in which government stays out of the way. So when you see a pattern of rising costs, and indeed, in most cases, quality declining, then there's some artificial disruption happening here, whether it's a monetary disruption, a regulatory disruption, a redistributive disruption. And part of the problem is that we don't have this. I always imagine a parallel universe in which none of this happens. And I can't point to it to show you the cost of living plummeting when we actually free up markets to produce and create and deploy capital efficiently. And we can discuss the regulatory changes that have happened since 2008, for example, in the banking sector, and how those have driven up costs across the entire economy, costs that are going to be passed on to consumers, because when you make banks less efficient and less productive, we all pay for it, because banks are the most important engine in the economy. And when you cripple that engine, you cripple all of us.
Yeah, no, quick intervention. At least in that sector, the parallel universe that you mentioned actually does exist. That would simply be the agricultural policy of New Zealand and Australia. They had, or New Zealand at least, had an agricultural policy that was even worse than the European Common Agricultural Policy, much more interventionist. They've reduced that very quickly in the early 1980s. And their agriculture collapsed for a short time, but then it did recover through productivity improvement and moving into subsectors where the country had comparative advantage. That's the main reason why we get New Zealand wine nowadays here. They weren't exporting that before the 80s. They just had to move into areas which they were good, in which they could export and survive under market conditions, and that's what they did. So that is your parallel universe for agriculture, at least, and that's what gave us the Sauvignon Blanc.
Yeah, we can find particular sectors in which you don't find regulations, particular countries in which a particular sector is not regulated, and when we do, we always see the same pattern. It's always the same. Prices drop, quality goes up.
I'll come back to Lee at the end. Lee, do you have anything to add? Something that I would like you to add is how can we start the process of getting rid of this in agriculture?
Well, so long as we're in the EU, or at least on the terms we're currently in, i.e. locked into the CAP as a fundamental part of the treaty system, we are. Because it is a fundamental part of the major deal between the French and the Germans from the very outset, and the Dutch and the Belgians and others. It's locked in. Any attempt to renegotiate with the UK doesn't fall apart of the CAP, like e.g. Gibraltar. Gibraltar's a rock. Its case is rather different from ours. The French won't wash it. So we would have to have an entirely different treaty structure, which would be a much looser trade relations with agriculture, after that title was set aside. Very quickly on a couple of the other points. I'm glad New Zealand was mentioned. I was going to mention the hobbits too. And of course, it's quite interesting if you look at some of the literature which has been produced by the farming unions, who initially were rather concerned, and did an audit after the event, several years after the event, and realised that the number of farmers which went bust was in the double figures. There was an initial shock for 2 to 3 years, and then they became competitive and they reduced it. So the farmers themselves are now for a global change of that sort. On the business about the food prices, as I say, there's been, after 2008, so I remember I was in Afghanistan in 2008, and one of the reasons was, which was being pushed for the whole funding for the grain programme in Helmand, was the fact that global food prices were high, and therefore it was extremely difficult for them to come off narcotics at the time. The same reason, as a result of that, when subsequently food prices dropped and do drop, then obviously the cost of living impact will be disproportionately higher for guys who are within a tariff zone, a high tariff zone for agricultural products, which means the EU, and of course in many certain other countries, including the US. Very quickly also, the French farmers, I don't have it necessarily into the French farmers, I've lived over there and I've got the French friends and so on and so forth. But the basic reality is, I speak, I love places, and I love French wine, excessively. But the point is, if we were to nationalise the CAP, if we were to nationalise the CAP overnight, and just run an identical system, with all its flaws, with all the funding for cement factories and golf companies and airports, and the National Worm Breeders Association, all these characters who get the grants. Lambeth Council, I think Lambeth Council was another one. Central.
There's not much agriculture in Lambeth.
Exactly. The Tower Hamlets, I think it was actually. I apologise. We would save ourselves overnight £5 billion because that's how much we are subsidising, not even British farmers. It's not even British taxpayers subsidising British farmers. It's a foreign subvention. And this takes me on to the final point, which is the ethics of it all. Because you can argue potentially that, like Johnny Watton in that butter advert, the contrary of what he says, we want to preserve our countryside in a particular way, and therefore we should subsidise them for them. Now, I don't necessarily help with that. You could argue a more narrow focus and say, well, hill farmers have got a really bad deal under the CAP, and therefore we should simply just subsidise those borderline communities and lifestyles which do produce something which the society wants, and the cost of living for those people could be subsidised. I think that's morally a better case to argue, but we certainly can't keep on going with the unethical situation in which we go. Okay, thank you.